Picture this. You're 19 years old, standing in a cold stone cell in the Tower of London, and you're practicing how to lay your head on a wooden block. Your hands shake as you kneel beside your narrow bed, positioning your neck just so, rehearsing the moment when the executioner's axe will end your life. The year is 1542, and you are Catherine Howard, fifth wife of King Henry VIII, and tomorrow morning you will die for crimes you're not even sure you committed. But what brought you to this moment isn't just a tale of royal marriage gone wrong. It's the story of how a teenage girl became a pawn in the most dangerous game in Tudor England, where one wrong move could cost you your head. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Henry VIII's matrimonial disasters. It's the story of how absolute power can transform desire into obsession, how political necessity can destroy innocence, and how a young woman's attempt to find love in a loveless world would ultimately lead her to the scaffold. The name Catherine Howard might not be as familiar as Anne Boleyn, but her story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of this tragedy. By 1540, Henry VIII wasn't the athletic young prince who had once dazzled European courts. At 49, he was a bloated, paranoid monster weighing over 300 pounds, his body ravaged by what historians believe was diabetes and possibly syphilis. His legs were covered in festering ulcers that filled his chambers with the stench of rotting flesh, and his mood swings had become so violent that courtiers lived in constant terror of triggering his rage. But it was what had happened to his previous wives that cast the darkest shadow over his court. Anne Boleyn, beheaded. Jane Seymour, dead in childbirth. Anne of Cleves, divorced and exiled. By the time Henry's eyes fell on Catherine Howard, everyone knew that marrying the king was quite literally a matter of life and death. Catherine wasn't born into this nightmare. She entered the world around 1521 as the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a minor nobleman whose family name carried weight, but whose purse remained embarrassingly light. When Catherine was just 5 years old, her mother died, and her father, unable to care for his numerous children, sent Catherine to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Chesworth House, where Catherine would spend her formative years, was a sprawling manor in Sussex that housed dozens of young nobles sent there for education and safekeeping. But what Agnes Howard called education, modern observers might recognize as systematic neglect. The old Duchess was more interested in her own pleasures than supervising the moral development of her charges, and the young people in her care were left largely to their own devices. It was here, in the poorly supervised dormitories and shadowy corridors of Chesworth House, that Catherine's troubles began. At just 13 years old, she caught the attention of Henry Manox, her music teacher. Manox was a grown man in his 20s, experienced in the ways of the world and skilled at manipulating young girls who craved attention and affection. You have to understand the psychological dynamics at play here. Catherine was a child who had lost her mother, been abandoned by her father, and was now living in a household where adult supervision was minimal and emotional support was non-existent. When Manox began paying special attention to her, praising her musical abilities and offering her the affection she desperately craved, Catherine had no framework for understanding that she was being groomed by a predator. The relationship that developed between Catherine and Manox wasn't a romance, despite how some historians have tried to romanticize it. It was sexual abuse of a minor by an adult in a position of authority. Catherine, barely into puberty, was manipulated into believing that what was happening to her was love, that she was special, that this secret relationship made her mature and important. When the relationship was discovered, Manox was dismissed from his position, but the damage to Catherine had already been done. She had learned that her value lay in her ability to please men, that love came with secrets and shame, and that her own desires and boundaries were less important than maintaining the affection of those who claimed to care for her. But Catherine's education in manipulation and abuse was far from over. Soon after Manox's departure, she became involved with Francis Dereham, a gentleman pensioner in the Dowager Duchess's household. Dereham was closer to Catherine's age, but no less skilled at exploitation. He convinced Catherine that they were married in the eyes of God, that their secret vows made their physical relationship legitimate, that she belonged to him in ways that transcended legal and social boundaries. The relationship with Dereham was more complex than what had happened with Manox. Catherine was older now, around 15, and she seems to have genuinely believed that she was engaged to Dereham. They exchanged gifts, made promises to each other, and conducted themselves as if they were husband and wife. But even this relationship was built on deception and manipulation. Dereham used Catherine's emotional vulnerability and inexperience to convince her to do things that put her reputation and future at risk. When their relationship was discovered, the consequences were swift and severe. Catherine was sent away from Chesworth House in disgrace, her reputation already tainted by rumors of promiscuity and poor judgment. She was placed in the household of her cousin, Queen Anne of Cleves, Henry's recently divorced fourth wife, where it was hoped she might learn proper behavior and possibly attract a suitable marriage. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Catherine Howard. In late 1539, she was appointed as a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves, bringing her into direct contact with the royal court and, inevitably, with King Henry VIII himself. The king, recently emerged from his disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, was in the market for a new wife, and his eyes quickly fell on the young, vivacious Catherine. What Henry saw was a beautiful teenager with auburn hair, sparkling eyes, and a personality that seemed to embody youth and vitality. What he didn't see was a young woman who had been systematically abused and manipulated, who had learned to equate her worth with her ability to please men, and who had no understanding of the deadly game she was about to enter. The courtship, if it can be called that, was swift and overwhelming. Henry showered Catherine with gifts, attention, and promises of love that seemed to offer everything she had been searching for her entire life. Here was the most powerful man in England, possibly in all of Europe, declaring his devotion to her. For a young woman who had spent her life craving security and affection, Henry's attention must have seemed like a dream come true. But there were those at court who recognized the danger Catherine was walking into. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had orchestrated the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves as part of a larger political strategy. When that marriage failed and Henry's attention turned to Catherine, Cromwell found himself in an impossible position. He knew that opposing the king's desires would be dangerous, but he also understood that Catherine's past relationships could eventually be used against both her and anyone associated with her rise to power. Cromwell's fears were well-founded. The Howard family, Catherine's relatives, were ambitious and ruthless players in the deadly game of Tudor politics. They saw Catherine's relationship with the king as an opportunity to restore their family's influence and power. Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester and a Howard ally, actively encouraged the relationship, despite knowing about Catherine's past entanglements. The wedding took place on July 28, 1540, just 3 weeks after Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. It was a small, private ceremony at Oatlands Palace with only a handful of witnesses present. Catherine, barely 19 years old, became Queen of England, but the celebration was muted by the execution of Thomas Cromwell, which took place on the very same day. The symbolism of that timing was lost on no one at court. As Catherine spoke her wedding vows, Cromwell was being led to the scaffold, his head soon to roll, because he had fallen from Henry's favor. The message was clear. Proximity to the king brought power, but it also brought unimaginable danger. For the first year of their marriage, Catherine seemed to thrive in her role as queen. She was young, beautiful, and energetic, bringing a sense of vitality to a court that had grown accustomed to Henry's increasingly dark moods and physical deterioration. She enjoyed the luxuries of royal life and the beautiful gowns, the jewelry, the deference of those around her, and the apparent devotion of her husband. But beneath the surface, Catherine was struggling with the isolation and pressure of her position. She was Queen of England, but she was also essentially a prisoner, her every move watched and analyzed by courtiers who were constantly seeking advantage or looking for signs of weakness they could exploit. She had no real friends, no confidants she could trust, and no one to guide her through the treacherous waters of Tudor court politics. It was during this period of isolation and vulnerability that Catherine made the decision that would ultimately cost her life. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, began paying attention to her. Culpeper was young, handsome, and charming, everything that Henry was not. More importantly, he offered Catherine something she had been craving: genuine affection and companionship. The relationship that developed between Catherine and Culpeper wasn't immediately sexual, but it was certainly emotional. They began exchanging letters, meeting in secret, and conducting what amounted to an emotional affair right under the nose of the most dangerous man in England. Catherine, with her history of being manipulated by older men, may have seen Culpeper as her first real chance at genuine love. But Catherine wasn't the only one with a complicated past. Culpeper himself was far from the romantic figure he might have appeared to be. In 1541, he had been pardoned by the king for raping a park keeper's wife and murdering a villager who tried to help her. He was, in other words, a violent criminal whose charming exterior concealed a deeply disturbed personality. The letters exchanged between Catherine and Culpeper reveal a young woman desperately seeking love and emotional connection. In one letter, Catherine writes, "It makes my heart to die to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company." These aren't the words of a calculating adulteress. They're the words of a teenager who had never experienced healthy love and was confusing attention with affection, secrecy with intimacy. The meetings between Catherine and Culpeper were facilitated by Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's executed brother. Jane, who had played a role in her own husband's downfall by testifying against him, was now helping Catherine conduct what amounted to treason. Her motivations remain unclear. Perhaps she was seeking revenge against the king who had destroyed her family, or perhaps she simply enjoyed the danger and intrigue. The secret meetings took place in various locations as the court traveled around the country. Sometimes they met in Catherine's private chambers, sometimes in gardens or galleries, always with Jane Boleyn standing guard. The meetings were brief and tension-filled, as everyone involved understood that discovery would mean death. Meanwhile, Francis Dereham, Catherine's former lover from Chesworth House, had reappeared in her life. Seeking to capitalize on his connection to the new queen, Dereham had been appointed to her household staff. His presence was a constant reminder of Catherine's past, and his knowledge of their previous relationship gave him a dangerous power over her. The walls began closing in on Catherine in the summer of 1541. John Lascelles, a reformist who opposed the Howard family's Catholic leanings, came forward with information about Catherine's past relationships. Lascelles claimed that his sister, Mary Hall, who had worked at Chesworth House, had told him about Catherine's affairs with both Manox and Dereham. When this information reached the king, his reaction was swift and terrible. Henry, who had been completely infatuated with his young wife, felt utterly betrayed. But his anger wasn't just personal, it was political. If Catherine had been married to Dereham before her marriage to the king, then her marriage to Henry was invalid. If she had hidden her previous relationships, then she had committed treason. The investigation that followed was thorough and merciless. Both Manox and Dereham were arrested and tortured until they revealed everything they knew about their relationships with Catherine. Dereham, under extreme duress, revealed Catherine's current relationship with Culpeper, sealing both of their fates. Catherine herself was arrested and confined to her apartments while the investigation continued. For weeks, she was interrogated by the king's counselors, men who were skilled at extracting confessions through psychological pressure and the constant threat of torture. Catherine, who had never been equipped to handle such pressure, alternated between hysteria and catatonia. The letters between Catherine and Culpeper were discovered and presented as evidence of treasonous adultery. Culpeper himself was arrested and, under torture, confessed to his relationship with the Queen. He was executed on December 10th, 1541, his head displayed on London Bridge as a warning to others. Francis Dereham met an even more gruesome fate. Because he was considered to have committed treason of a more serious nature, having concealed his previous relationship with Catherine, he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. On the same day that Culpeper was beheaded, Dereham was dragged through the streets of London on a hurdle, hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still alive, his entrails burned before his eyes, before he was finally beheaded and his body cut into quarters. Jane Boleyn, who had facilitated the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper, was also arrested. But Jane presented a problem for Henry's prosecutors. She claimed to be insane, and English law prohibited the execution of the mentally ill. Henry's solution was characteristically ruthless. He had Parliament pass a new law making it treason for an insane person to conceal information from the king. The law was clearly designed specifically to allow Jane's execution. Throughout all of this, Catherine remained imprisoned, her fate still uncertain. Henry seemed unable to decide what to do with her. Part of him apparently hoped that she might be spared, that some legal technicality might be found to save her life. But the evidence of her relationships with Culpeper was too strong, and the political pressure to make an example of her was too great. On February 11, 1542, Parliament passed a bill of attainder declaring Catherine guilty of treason and stripping her of her title as queen. The bill stated that she had led an abominable, base, carnal, voluptuous, and vicious life, and had concealed her past from the king. 2 days later, it received royal assent, sealing Catherine's fate. The night before her execution, Catherine made a request that speaks to her youth and terror. She asked to practice laying her head on the block. The executioner's block was brought to her cell, and she spent hours rehearsing the movements, trying to ensure that her death would be dignified and swift. This image, a 19-year-old girl practicing her own execution, remains one of the most heartbreaking in all of Tudor history. On the morning of February 13, 1542, Catherine was led from her cell in the Tower of London to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was dressed simply in black, her auburn hair hidden beneath a white cap. Contemporary accounts describe her as pale but composed, her fear controlled but visible. As she mounted the scaffold, Catherine spoke her final words to the small crowd of witnesses. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." With those words, she acknowledged both her royal status and her genuine feelings for the man whose love had cost them both their lives. Catherine knelt at the block and positioned her head carefully, her practice from the night before, ensuring that the process went smoothly. The executioner, skilled in his grisly trade, brought down the axe with a single stroke. Catherine Howard, Queen of England, was dead at the age of 19. Her body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London, the same chapel where Anne Boleyn had been buried 6 years earlier. There was no funeral, no ceremony, no marking of her passing, except for the notation in official records that the former queen had been executed for treason. The aftermath of Catherine's execution sent shockwaves through Henry's court and across Europe. Here was a king who had now executed 2 wives, both of them young women who had been guilty more of poor judgment than genuine malice. The pattern was becoming clear. Marriage to Henry VIII was a death sentence waiting to happen. Henry himself seemed genuinely shattered by Catherine's betrayal and execution. Contemporary observers noted that he aged rapidly in the months following her death, his already deteriorating health declining even further. He would marry once more to Catherine Parr, but he never again showed the kind of infatuation he had felt for Catherine Howard. The Howard family, who had orchestrated Catherine's rise to power, paid a heavy price for their ambitions. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, was arrested and sentenced to death, escaping execution only because Henry himself died before the sentence could be carried out. The family's political influence was destroyed, and they would never again achieve the prominence they had enjoyed during Catherine's brief reign. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Catherine Howard's story is how preventable it all was. At every stage of her life, the adults who were supposed to protect her instead exploited her for their own purposes. Her step-grandmother neglected her education and allowed predators access to her. Her relatives used her as a political pawn. Even those who claimed to love her, like Culpeper, were more interested in their own pleasure than her safety. Catherine's story is often told as a tale of a promiscuous young woman who got what she deserved, but that interpretation misses the deeper truth. Catherine Howard was a victim of systematic abuse who never had the chance to develop healthy relationships or sound judgment. She was a teenager trying to find love in a world where love was a luxury that few could afford, and where the slightest misstep could cost you your life. The parallels between Catherine's story and modern cases of abuse are striking and disturbing. Like many abuse victims, Catherine learned early that her value lay in her ability to please men. She confused attention with affection, secrecy with intimacy, and manipulation with love. Her attempts to find genuine connection led her into increasingly dangerous situations because she had never been taught what healthy relationships looked like. The men in Catherine's life, Manox, Dereham, Henry, and even Culpeper, all used their power and experience to exploit her vulnerability. They took advantage of her youth, her need for affection, and her lack of guidance to manipulate her into situations that served their interests rather than hers. When those situations became dangerous, they were quick to save themselves at her expense. Even more disturbing is how Catherine's story was shaped by the political and social systems of her time. In Tudor England, women had virtually no legal rights and no agency over their own lives. Catherine couldn't choose whom to marry, where to live, or even whom to associate with. Every decision about her life was made by men who saw her as a tool to be used for their own purposes. The court system that condemned Catherine was stacked against her from the beginning. She was not allowed legal representation, could not call witnesses in her defense, and was considered guilty until proven innocent. The evidence against her was obtained through torture and coercion, and the laws under which she was condemned were literally written specifically to ensure her death. But Catherine's story also reveals the human capacity for resilience and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite everything that had been done to her, despite the terror and isolation of her final months, she managed to face her death with a composure that impressed even her executioners. Her final words showed that she understood the choice she had made, to seek love despite the consequences, and that she was willing to accept responsibility for that choice. Today, Catherine Howard's story serves as a reminder that behind every historical narrative of political intrigue and royal drama, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and compassion. Catherine was more than just another of Henry VIII's wives. She was a young woman who tried to find love and happiness in a world designed to exploit and destroy her. Her grave in the Tower of London bears no marker, no indication of who lies beneath the cold stone floor. But her story lives on, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and systematic abuse. Catherine Howard died at 19, but her voice still calls out across the centuries, asking us to remember her not as a failed queen or a promiscuous teenager, but as a human being who deserved better than the world gave her. The young woman who practiced laying her head on the executioner's block deserves to be remembered not for her mistakes, but for her courage in the face of certain death. And perhaps in remembering her story with compassion rather than judgment, we can honor not just her memory, but the memory of all those who have suffered in silence, whose voices have been silenced by those who claimed to love them. In the end, Catherine Howard's story is not just about the past. It's about the present, about the ongoing struggle to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them, and about the importance of remembering that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were real people with real hopes and dreams whose lives mattered just as much as those of the kings and queens who held their fates in their hands. What do you think about Catherine's tragic story? Have you ever wondered how different history might have been if she had been born into a different time, or if the adults in her life had chosen to protect rather than exploit her? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as moving as I did, please consider sharing it with others who appreciate learning about the hidden human stories behind historical events.